Hey guys, tonight we're diving fork first into the steamy fog of a medieval morning. Not a royal one, mind you. No golden goblets or roasted swans. Nope, this is the kind of dawn that smells like sheep smoke and someone forgot to wash the cauldron yesterday. You're standing barefoot on frost-bitten earth, your breath rising like steam from a well-loved kettle, and your stomach is already growling louder than the neighbor's ox. That's right. Welcome to the world of the medieval farm worker's breakfast. So before you relax, take a second to like and subscribe if you find value in what we share. And hey, let me know in the comments. What time is it where you are and where are you listening from? Dim those lights, fire up a fan for that cozy background sound, and let's settle in for the journey ahead. You wake up not because you want to, but because someone has opened the shutters and let in the freezing air. There's no alarm clock here unless you count the rooster who seems personally offended by your continued existence. You're lying on straw in a small wooden room, your breath visible in the cold. The fire in the hearth has gone out overnight. You can smell the ashes. You can hear someone outside spitting into their hands, getting ready to work. And inside your belly, a quiet mutiny is brewing. It's breakfast time, or at least it would be if someone had made breakfast. The first thing you reach for isn't food, it's your boots. They're stiff and cold, and there's a good chance something crawled into them overnight. You shake them out with a little dance silent because everyone else is still pretending not to be awake yet, and shove your feet inside. Congratulations, you've survived the medieval morning initiation. Now to the food. You wander toward the hearth where a large pot sits blackened and suspiciously lumpy. It's the same pot as last night, and maybe the night before that too. Inside is what we'll generously call a pancake, though really it's a round, thick patty made of soured barley flour, wild garlic, and whatever root vegetables didn't rot in the cellar. Fried on a flat stone. It's heavy, chewy, and aggressively functional. But hey, it's warm. You tear off a piece and chew slowly. It tastes like ashes, onions, and ambition. Maybe a hint of mint, but that could just be your imagination. The truth is pancakes, if we can keep calling them, that were actually common among early medieval farm workers. Not the fluffy buttermilk wonders we're used to, but flat, crude discs of dough cooked over coals. Sometimes, if you were lucky, they'd be mixed with leeks or wild herbs. If you were very lucky, someone in the house would have saved a bit of leftover fat from last night's broth and used that to grease the pan. That's the dream. A popular historical truth here. Many peasants didn't eat first thing in the morning. They worked a few hours and then came in for what was technically dinner. But in the chillier months like this morning, they needed something. Anything. Which brings us back to the joyless miracle you're chewing on right now. The breakfast pancake. It's thick because thin batter requires milk or ale. And that's too precious to waste at dawn. It's sour because the flour has been fermenting for days in a wooden bowl tucked behind the oven. It's unevenly cooked because, frankly, nobody stirred the fire properly. But somehow it works. It sits in your stomach like a brave little shield against cold and hunger. You eat in silence. Everyone does. Words are rationed too. One person grunts approval at their pancake. Another tries dipping theirs in last night's grease-cold, solidified, and tasting vaguely of smoked fish. And while you're chewing, you look outside. It's foggy. The frost hasn't melted yet. And beyond the fence, the plow waits like an old friend you didn't want to see today. But before you can think too much about it, someone claps you on the shoulder. That's the signal. Pancake time is over. Work time has begun. But here's a weird little detail you weren't expecting. Sometimes these crude breakfast cakes weren't eaten fresh. They were made days in advance, stacked in piles, and reheated near the fire when needed. Some were even carried into the fields like pocket food. Medieval granola bars, if you will, though significantly more depressing. What makes them interesting is not just the taste, but the logic. In an age with no fridges, limited fuel, and back-breaking labor, these little bread discs were marvels of survival. Dense, portable, and strangely comforting. especially when you could sneak some dried apple or honey into the batter, rare luxuries that turned this peasant dish into a celebration. You remember vaguely that one spring morning when someone had managed to get a handful of wild strawberries and mashed them into the dough. That day, the pancakes were pink and strange and utterly delightful. You worked twice as fast that day. Maybe it was joy. Maybe it was sugar. Maybe it was because the neighbor's dog was chasing you. Who knows? And here's where the scholars start debating. Were these pancakes really breakfast or just leftover breadstuffs eaten at random times of day? Was breakfast even a thing in the medieval world, or are we just projecting modern mealtime ideas onto the past? Some historians argue that the medieval day was split into two main meals, a mid-morning dinner and an evening supper. Breakfast, they say, was irregular, maybe even frowned upon by moralists who thought eating early was greedy or gluttonous. Others counter that in rural life survival trumped sermon and people ate what they could when they could, especially when hard labor was involved. Honestly, while they're arguing, you're finishing your pancake. It's tougher now. Cold. A little rubbery. But you fold it in half and save the last bit in your pouch. You never know how long the ox will behave today. Sometimes you don't get to come back in until sundown. Outside, the sun is finally starting to rise. Barely. The sky is the color of wet ash. You step into it like you've done 1,000 mornings before. The fog clings to your sleeves, the ground crunches under your boots. And in your chest, behind the sour pancake and the morning silence, there's something resembling peace. You made it, you're awake, and you've had breakfast. Well, sort of. 3 light jokes just for you before we continue medieval pancakes, because sometimes sadness can be served hot. The rooster called. He wants you to know he's already judged your outfit. If the pancake bites back, it's probably just extra protein. The house is still quiet when you slip back inside, not for rest, but for a moment of warmth. And maybe, if you're lucky, a second helping of something hot. Outside, the oxen snort and paw at the frost-bitten soil. Inside, the hearth is waking up again, slowly exhaling heat like an old grudging dragon. You kneel near the flames, not out of reverence, but necessity. This is the warmest place in your universe. And next to it, nestled in black iron and soot, is a pot. A big one, battered, soot-covered, and unmistakably alive with sound. It bubbles softly like it's whispering secrets through its lid. This is the barley pot. The Old Faithful, and it smells like morning. Barley porridge, also known as pottage mash. Or just the stuff, is less of a recipe and more of a relationship. You don't cook it once, you cook it forever. Every day you add something. Every day you take something out. It's alive, it evolves, it forgives. And right now, it's almost ready. You lift the lid and give it a stir. The wooden spoon scrapes the bottom, bringing up soft lumps of barley, yesterday's cabbage, and maybe a bone for flavor. The smell is rich and earthy with a hint of smoke and something you can't quite name. Is it carrot, onion, last month's turnip? It's best not to ask. The mystery is half the charm. Here's a widely known fact. Barley was the backbone of the medieval diet. Cheap, filling, and hardy in the fields, it fed people across Europe for centuries. Wheat was for the rich. Barley was for everyone else. Boiled, fermented, baked, or even drunk, it was the grain that did everything except sweep the floor. This morning, it's doing its part as breakfast. You ladle yourself a bowl. Well, it's not so much a ladle as a carefully carved scoop, but it gets the job done. The porridge sloshes into the bowl like a muddy tide, thick and lumpy and steaming. You sit by the hearth and take a sip. Yes, a sip. You don't chew porridge. You learn to drink it slowly, letting it coat your tongue with warmth and fatigue in equal measure. It tastes like work. It tastes like everything and nothing all at once. There's salt if you're lucky. A few herbs from the garden maybe. But mostly it tastes like something you need, not something you want. And that really is the whole point. You watch the steam rise from your bowl and drift toward the low rafters. Up there, the smoke curls around bundles of drying herbs, a few pairs of old shoes, and one lonely sausage that's been hanging for so long it may have applied for citizenship. No one else is speaking yet. Not really. Morning talk in a medieval farmhouse is a series of grunts, throat clears, and monosyllabic check-ins. I, cold. Ox eye, frozen. You join the chorus with a nod. The barley porridge settles in your stomach like a brick wrapped in a warm blanket. It's not glamorous, but it keeps you standing. And more importantly, it keeps you moving. Because let's face it, nobody in this house has time for leisure digestion. There are fields to plow, fences to mend, chickens to chase, and a cartwheel that's about to fall off again. And yet, even in this whirlwind of usefulness, the morning porridge is sacred. There's a strange peace in its repetition. Stir, scoop, sip, like a slow, edible chant. It's the closest you'll come to a morning ritual unless you count trying to light damp kindling while muttering medieval swear words under your breath. You glance around. Someone else has joined you. They're cradling their bowl like it's a newborn. They nod. You nod. The mutual understanding is clear. We do not love the porridge, but we respect it. Now for the fun bit, did you know that some people used to boil barley overnight with hot stones and covered pots to save firewood? That's right. They'd build up the embers in the hearth, nestle the pot deep into the ashes, throw in a couple of sun-warmed rocks, and leave it there till dawn. The result, a soft, slow-cooked porridge that could, in the right light, almost be described as luxurious. Almost. Of course you don't have hot stones this morning. You have whatever embers haven't given up yet. But the principle remains. Breakfast is not just a meal. It's a process, a preparation, a quiet battle against cold and time. Now for something quirkier, in some regions, people flavored their morning porridge with beer. Yes, beer. But not the bubbly kind that gets you dancing. This was small beer, barely alcoholic, brewed in the kitchen and safer than water. You'd pour a little into the porridge to give it body flavor and just the tiniest hint of rebellion. You've never had beer porridge, but you like the sound of it. It feels very local wizard experimenting with breakfast potions, and you respect that energy. As you finish your bowl, the sun starts poking through the shutters. It's barely risen, and already you're thinking about dinner. But before that, there's work. Always work. You place your bowl on the bench and rise, brushing off your tunic. It's already speckled with bits of barley ash and something that might be yesterday's egg. You're not sure. You don't care. Outside, the world is slowly turning from gray to brown. You hear someone yawn behind you, someone else groans, someone else belches, a symphony of satisfaction. And for just a second, you think maybe this day won't be so bad, until someone calls your name and hands you a shovel. A question lingers in your head, whispered from the corner of some medieval library. Was breakfast always so bleak for peasants, or have we romanticized it beyond reason? Some scholars argue that peasant breakfasts were more diverse than we assume, especially in harvest seasons or regions with richer trade routes. Others hold fast to the image of thin gruel and cold crusts, citing monastic records and market inventories. You just know that this morning porridge won. 3 sleepy jokes before we head back outside. Medieval porridge. Perfect for eating and insulating your boots. Stir it too fast and it might bite back. Add beer and you've got brunch with consequences. The cold doesn't care that you just had porridge. It wraps itself around your ankles anyway, sneaking past your boots and licking the edge of your sleeves. The sun is trying its best, spreading a thin layer of gold across the fields, but you know better. It's all show, no heat. You're outside now, somewhere between sleep and duty, trudging toward the tool shed when it hits you. You forgot your second breakfast. Not food, drink. Your throat is dry, and not in the poetic, dramatic sense. It's dry like a sack of barley left open in winter. You need something. Not water. Never water. Even if you had some in a wooden cup, even if you broke through the morning frost to fill a bucket, the risk isn't worth it. 'Cause let's be honest, water is for washing, not drinking. Not unless you like surprise stomach problems with your sunrise. Instead, you head for the jug. It's tucked in the shade away from the fire, wrapped in a damp cloth to keep it cool. Inside is your salvation small beer. Now let's be very clear. This is not beer as you know it. This isn't a pint of golden fizz with a foamy head and notes of citrus. This is beer's ancient, mild-mannered cousin, the kind you can drink at 6 a.m. without wrecking the plow. It's flat, murky, the color of pond water with ambition, but it's yours. You lift the jug and take a long swig. It tastes like barley bark and just a whisper of yesterday's bucket. But it's wet, it's safe, and it's surprisingly comforting. You sigh through your nose, that's better. And that, friends, is how medieval farm workers caffeinated themselves without coffee, tea, or even clean water. See, caffeine wasn't part of the European morning ritual until centuries later. Coffee didn't hit the European scene until the 16th century, and even then it was reserved for the rich and the clerical. Tea, that was still sailing its way out of Asia. So what did people do? They brewed, they fermented. They turned grains and scraps into drinks that wouldn't kill them. Small beer was the breakfast beverage of choice for peasants across Europe, especially in the British Isles, Germany, and the Low Countries. Low in alcohol, high in hydration, and easy to make with whatever barley, wheat, or rye you had lying around. Kids drank it. Elders drank it. You drank it because if you were thirsty and not a fan of dysentery, beer was the answer. And no, it didn't get you drunk. Not unless you drank several gallons, and even then only if the brewer got ambitious. You drink deeply again and close your eyes for a second. The cold doesn't bite quite so hard now. Your limbs feel looser. The day feels doable. Nearby, someone else is pouring from another jug. You can hear the glug, glug, glug of morning survival. There's a clink of ceramic and a quiet, raspy laugh. The beer is working. You remember when you tried to make it yourself once. Just once. It involved boiling barley with a bit of wild hop, straining the lot through a straw basket and praying to whichever saint oversees fermentation. The result drinkable. Barely. But it gave you a sense of pride and possibly a rash. Still, you learned something. Small beer wasn't just a drink, it was a daily ritual. Part of the rhythm of farm life. Wake, stir porridge, sip beer, feed animals, work fields, sip beer again. Repeat until winter ends, or you do. A fun side note, in some areas people flavored their morning beer with herbs like yarrow mugwort or even ground ivy, not for taste necessarily, but for their supposed medicinal or preservative qualities. The result was a brew that tasted like someone dropped a salad into it and walked away. But hey, who are we to judge? You take another sip and look down at the jug. There's a beetle floating on the surface. You fish it out with your sleeve. That's breakfast protein sorted then. And now the academic debate creeps in like fog under a door. Some scholars argue that small beer's role in daily life is overstated, that it wasn't universally available and water sources weren't always deadly. In well-maintained wells or springs, water could be safe, especially in rural areas. But others counter that beer, even weak beer, offered consistency, a known quantity, a slight nutritional boost, a flavor that masked the iron tang of a rusty bucket. You're not here to debate, you're here to hydrate. The beer is nearly gone when the others start calling. Time to work. The oxen aren't going to harness themselves. The fields don't till by candlelight. And nobody ever thanked you for being fashionably late to a manure pile. You tuck the jug back in its corner, giving it a fond pat. You'll be back by mid-morning. Maybe. Hopefully. Your breath fogs the air. The shovel handle is slick with frost. And the beer is quietly whispering to your limbs, move. Just a little faster now. Off you go. 3 gentle giggles to go with your medieval morning pint. Small beer because you deserve hydration and a vague sense of rebellion. No foam, no fizz, no regrets. It's not alcoholism if your bishop says it's breakfast. The fields stretch ahead like a damp brown quilt stitched with hoofprints and hope. You've been out here for what feels like 100 years, but is probably closer to 2 hours. Your breath clouds the air in little puffs, and your shoulders ache with the kind of bone-deep weariness that comes only from convincing a stubborn ox to walk in a straight line. And yet through it all, there's one thing keeping your spirit afloat. It's not inspiration. It's not divine motivation. It's not even your fondness for that one donkey who doesn't kick. It's bread. Not fresh, golden, fluffy bread. That would be far too modern. No, what you've got waiting for you tucked in a cloth bundle inside your satchel is a crust, a hunk, a chunk, a relic of a loaf from some time earlier this week or last week, or a little from both. You're not sure. It's hard to tell with medieval bread, literally. You settle onto a fence post for a moment and reverently you pull it out. This is crust diplomacy, the ancient and slightly dangerous art of breaking your bread without breaking a tooth or insulting the person who baked it. You tap it gently, it makes a dull thud. Good sign. That means it'll last another day, or 10. You press your thumb against it. Not much give, you sniff it. Yep, still smells like flour smoke and something faintly herbal. You bite. Well, you try to bite. The crust resists. You go in from the side. That works better. It yields slightly like the door of a stubborn barn in spring, and beneath the crust, the interior is present, dense, gummy, slightly sour. Not spoiled, just matured. This is sourdough in its wildest, freest form. No baker's yeast here, just whatever wild yeast happened to drift through the window and say, I guess I'll live in this bowl now. It's not bad. It's not good. It just is. And that makes it perfect. See, in the medieval world, bread wasn't just food, it was identity. What kind of bread you ate, its flour, its shape, its color, said everything about who you were. White bread, soft and fine-milled, was for lords and ladies. Rye bread for your middling tradesmen and townfolk. But the peasant's daily loaf that was usually maslin, a mix of whatever was available. Barley, oats, rye, and sometimes even ground peas or beans thrown in for bulk. And the crust, oh, the crust was both a blessing and a burden. In towns, the word trencher was used for thick slabs of stale bread used as plates. After meals, these were fed to the poor, to dogs, or tossed to the compost pile. But out here in the countryside, your crust was your tool, your napkin, your breakfast, and occasionally your shield against social awkwardness. Because let's say you run into someone in the field, a neighbor, a traveling merchant, a cousin you owe oats to. You don't always have coins, you don't always have stories. But if you have a crust, you have hospitality. Here you might grunt, breaking off a corner. And in return, if you're lucky, they offer something back, a slice of cold cheese, a bit of salted turnip, or the holy grail of field food, a dollop of lard. Yes, lard. Don't wrinkle your nose. In the medieval peasant kitchen, lard was liquid gold. It kept for weeks, traveled well, and turned even the humblest crust into a feast. A crust dipped in lard was a crust elevated. And on very rare, very sacred mornings like the one time a pig was slaughtered in your village, you might even get lard with onions. That's high cuisine peasant edition. So today you take your crust dig into your pouch and produce the tiniest scrap of onion. It's nearly translucent. It might have been an onion. It might have been a dream. You place it on the bread, fold it over like a sad sandwich, and take another bite. Heaven. Here's your odd historical detail for today in some households. Bread crusts were rubbed with garlic and herbs and then hung over the hearth to dry. These were used for later stews or as rations for traveling. Others crumbled them into porridge to thicken it. And in rare moments of joy, they were toasted over coals and served with honey, usually when a guest arrived and you needed to impress them with your culinary sophistication. You've never had the honey version, but you've heard of it. Someone once years ago brought back a tiny beeswax-wrapped lump of honey from the abbey. It smelled like flowers and sunlight. The kids whispered about it like it was magic. It was gone in 2 licks. But it lives forever in local legend. You return your thoughts to the crust. You're down to the last third. That's the sacred part. The heel, some call it. You contemplate sharing it with the dog. The dog is watching you like he's part of a moral test. But you're hungry. You shrug and eat it. The dog sighs and walks away. You feel judged, deserved. But the crust did its job. It gave you calories, community, and something to think about besides back pain and frostbite. It told you that you're still alive, still chewing, still here. And now for the scholarly quibble of the day. Did peasants really eat stale bread as often as we imagine? Or is this another exaggeration born of modern romanticism? Some researchers argue that because bread was baked in large batches only once or twice a week, most bread was stale by modern standards but not inedible. It was softened with broth, dipped in wine, or mashed into stews. Others point out that not all peasants were equally poor, and some households had fresher options or baked flatbreads more regularly. It's a debate that will likely continue for a while longer than your crust will, at least. You stand up, stretch, roll your shoulders. The oxen are pulling at the yoke again, eager or confused, it's hard to tell. You whistle softly, toss the last breadcrumbs to the birds, and get back to it. But in your belly the crust rests proudly. The morning's treaty has been signed, and until the next meal that humble hunk of history will carry you through. 3 flaky little crumbs of humor before we go medieval bread, because crunchy and weapon grade aren't mutually exclusive. If it's soft, it's suspicious. If it's hard, it's trustworthy. Some crusts are so old they probably remember the Norman conquest. The wind has picked up again, and with it comes the familiar scent of livestock mud and something faintly egg-like, though not in the way you'd hope. You're halfway through hauling a cartload of kindling when the thought hits you. Wouldn't a nice warm egg be perfect right now? An egg, just one, soft-boiled maybe. Or poached if you're feeling ambitious. Or even just cracked into a skillet, sizzling gently over the hearth. You'd eat it slowly, reverently, and definitely not share. Except you don't have an egg. You rarely do. Because real eggs are a luxury, and luxuries don't usually wander into the peasant's breakfast bowl. But necessity, as always, is the mother of invention and the grandmother of culinary mischief. Which brings us to today's topic, the egg that wasn't an egg. You make your way toward the outbuilding where the cheesecloths hang, and your nose confirms it before your eyes do. That faintly sharp, nutty aroma, that's almond paste. Someone's at it again. Inside, hunched over a wooden table, is your cousin. She's holding a blob of something pale and firm-shaped, just so. From a distance, it could be an egg. Up close, it's clearly not. It's almond egg, a marvel of fast-day creativity and culinary rebellion. She's dusting it with a bit of ash for realism. You smile. She sees you and rolls her eyes. You want one. You nod, knowing full well she'll give you half at best. Here's your popular historical truth for today in the medieval world, especially among those observing religious fasts. Eggs were often off limits. Yes, even on seemingly random weekdays, which meant people got very, very clever at pretending their food was something it wasn't. And that's where mock eggs came in. These little miracles were made from ground almonds sweetened with honey or a bit of dried fruit paste, and then formed into egg-like shapes. Sometimes, if the maker was particularly whimsical or had something to prove, they'd color the yolk with saffron or carrot juice. Others filled the inside with soft cheese or spiced mash, then sealed it shut like a culinary Fabergé. It was part meal, part performance, part defiance. You take a bite. The outside is smooth, slightly oily. The inside is dense, crumbly sweet, but not cloying. It tastes nothing like egg, of course, but everything like cleverness. In that moment, you feel oddly rich, and that's the point. Mock foods weren't just about substitution. They were about imagination under pressure. You couldn't have butter, you made almond butter. No meat, you shaped root vegetables into fish. No cheese, you faked it with peas, salt, and a prayer. These weren't just meals, they were edible disguises. You sit down on a crate and chew slowly. Someone once told you about a monastery where the cooks made an entire feast of fake foods, fish made from rice, dough scales carved from pickled turnips, wine made from boiled raisins, and eggs made from almond paste and saffron. They served it all to visiting bishops on a strict fast day. The bishop reportedly cried with joy, or maybe with confusion. You're not sure if that story's true, but you want it to be. Back in your own kitchen, your cousin is now forming another almond egg and chuckling softly. Remember when I made one with goose fat by mistake? You do. It was dramatic. And here's today's quirky historical detail. In some noble households, mock eggs were used as status symbols served to guests in elaborate settings. The joke, of course, was that they looked humble but were actually expensive, since almond sugar and saffron were all imported luxuries. The rich had the real eggs but made fake ones to show off. Meanwhile, the poor wanted the real ones but had to settle for fantasy. Medieval irony at its finest. Outside, the wind howls again. You wrap your shawl tighter and lean back. The mock egg is gone now, but the aftertaste lingers, nutty, delicate, and oddly satisfying. You think briefly about the real eggs you occasionally saw in spring duck eggs poached from riverbanks. Hen's eggs bartered from a wealthier neighbor, the occasional miraculous find beneath the hay. When you did get one, you didn't fry it or scramble it, you poached it gently and served it over a crust of warm bread. You shared it, or at least pretended to. Eggs were more than food, they were occasions, which leads to today's open scholarly debate. How common were eggs in the diets of medieval peasants? Some sources suggest they were relatively accessible in rural settings, especially in spring when hens laid regularly. Others argue that most eggs were gathered and sold or taxed, especially under manorial systems, leaving little for the gatherers themselves. A few rebellious scholars suggest that eggs were eaten more often than records admit, but quietly, so as not to draw the attention of fasting rules or local authorities. You believe in egg sightings. You've had them, just not this week. The rest of the day stretches ahead full of mud oxen and a plow with a wobbly wheel. But the memory of the almond egg carries you a little further. It reminds you that even in the grimmest of kitchens, someone is always inventing a little joy. Maybe that's breakfast's secret. It's not about what's in your bowl. It's about the cleverness it took to get it there. 3 soft-shelled jokes to go with your fake egg. The medieval almond sig, because sometimes you want to lie to your taste buds gently. Technically egg-shaped, emotionally a hug. No chickens were consulted in the making of this breakfast. The smell hits you before the door opens. A rich, smoky, slightly sour aroma wafts out of the kitchen hut like a gentle slap to the face. You pause on the threshold, not because you're afraid, but because this is a sacred moment. Inside, nestled above the glowing coals, is the one thing that brings everyone together, whether they like it or not. The cauldron. It's enormous. Ancient, possibly older than the house itself. It's been blackened by time, dented by generations, and blessed with a flavor profile that can only be described as history. Nobody quite remembers who brought it here or what its original purpose was. Maybe soup, maybe witchcraft, probably both. Craft. But today it is the communal cauldron, and it's doing what it does best, quietly transforming leftovers into life support. You step inside and the warmth wraps around you like a patchy wool cloak. Someone's already stirred the pot this morning. A large wooden paddle leans against the wall, wet and slightly steaming. On the hearth, a ladle sits inside a cracked ceramic bowl, waiting to be summoned. You know the rule: first one in, first one stirs. You pick up the paddle and give it a gentle swirl. The contents groan. Inside the pot is everything and nothing. A barley base, maybe. Definitely yesterday's beans. Possibly some carrot peel, something green. A whisper of garlic if the wind is right, and a mystery object that might be a beet or a knuckle bone. You stir until it agrees to be soup. This is breakfast version 2. What happens when bread is too hard? The barley is gone and there's not enough small beer to feel festive. The cauldron is the safety net, the backup plan. The culinary shrug that says, well, we had to eat something. You ladle some into your bowl, sniff it cautiously, and take a sip. It's hot, a little vinegary, definitely bean forward. But as it settles into your stomach, you feel your shoulders drop a little. It's not glamorous, but it's warm. It's filling. It tastes like cooperation. That's because this isn't your cauldron, it's everyone's. Here's your well-known historical truth. In many peasant households, especially in communal or multi-family dwellings, a central pot was used for most meals and leftovers were rarely wasted. The same broth might bubble for days, being topped off with scraps. Peels, herbs, and occasionally, miraculously, a bit of meat. Some called it perpetual stew, others just called it the pot. It was part kitchen, part compost bin, part memory jar. What made it magical wasn't the flavor, it was the ritual. Every household had its rhythm. Some added scraps after dinner. Others poured in the end of the beer mash. A traveling cousin might toss in wild garlic from the woods. A child might sneak in a plum pit for good luck. You didn't ask too many questions. You just stirred, sipped, and carried on. You remember once years ago when someone found an entire apple floating near the top. An apple still vaguely recognizable. People came from 2 fields over to stare. Nobody admitted putting it in. It was eaten with great ceremony and more than a little superstition. That's the power of the communal cauldron, but it wasn't all miracles. You've had some truly cursed bowls too. Once someone added pickled cabbage and fish scraps. The result could only be described as emotional. People left the room. A dog howled, but no one wasted it. You all suffered together, and in that you were stronger. You finish your bowl and set it aside. The cauldron bubbles quietly behind you, already absorbing the day's gossip. Here's your odd detail of the day. In some places, especially colder regions, families would place flat stones or hot bricks into the stew overnight, then wrap it in cloth and bring it to the fields in the morning. It kept warm for hours, and when lunchtime came, the bundle was opened like a gift. Steaming, fragrant, slightly fermented, and utterly satisfying. It makes sense. After all, you couldn't stop work just to come home. You brought the cauldron with you in miniature form. And here comes the academic squabble. Was the perpetual stew truly a regular fixture of peasant life, or a romantic exaggeration by later writers and food historians? Some argue that fuel costs and sanitation made it impractical to keep a pot going for more than a couple days. Others insist that with careful management and communal coordination, it was not only feasible but logical, especially in winters when every calorie counted. You've seen it with your own eyes. Yesterday's broth becomes today's meal, becomes tomorrow's legend. And you don't question it too much. You just keep stirring. You're about to step outside again when someone taps your shoulder. It's the old man from the far end of the house, the one who always smells like onions and secretly feeds the hens bread soaked in beer. He holds out a bowl. "Warm it up for me, would you?" You nod. It's a quiet honor. The spoon slides into the pot once more. As the soup settles into the old man's hands and he gives a sleepy nod of thanks, you feel a strange kind of pride. Not in the taste or the ingredients, but in the act. The simplicity of it. You helped pass on warmth. That's enough. That's 3 stew-worthy jokes before we head back to the mud. The cauldron, because one-pot meals are cheaper than family therapy. If you can identify every ingredient, you're doing it wrong. It's not leftovers, it's ancestral layering. The sun is higher now, though you wouldn't know it from the color of the sky, still that muddy, hopeful gray that makes everything look like it's been gently rubbed with ash. The chores keep rolling forward one after another in that timeless rhythm of life, tied not to hours, but to animals. Speaking of which, the cows are lowing, not dramatically, just enough to remind you that they've noticed the delay. They're standing near the fence tails, swishing in half-hearted protest heads tilted with bovine judgment. It's time. You grab the wooden pail and trudge toward the little stone lean-to that passes for a barn. The air inside smells like damp straw, warm breath, and sweet decay, the familiar cocktail of early morning animal hospitality. And there she is, your favorite cow, big-eyed, slightly lopsided, smarter than most of your neighbors. She greets you with a snort and a sideways glance as if to say, "Took you long enough." You settle beside her, wrap the worn wool shawl a little tighter over your shoulders, and begin the slow, meditative task of milking. This is your breakfast now. In a world without lattes, cappuccinos, or any semblance of refrigeration, fresh milk was a fleeting miracle. You had to get it when it was warm straight from the source and drink it fast before the bacteria or the cats beat you to it. Milk was sustenance, yes, but it was also a kind of ephemeral wealth, perishable, practical, and surprisingly emotional. You couldn't store it for long, so you turned it into other things, butter, cheese, curds. But if you were lucky, really lucky, you got to drink it fresh with steam rising in little curls while the cow blinked at you like she was in on some ancient joke. You fill half the pail before your arms start to ache. The rhythm is soothing: squeeze, squirt, pause. Squeeze, squirt, listen to the splash. It's music, really. Quiet barn music with a beat that no one ever talks about. You sip a bit straight from the pail. No shame, no ceremony. It's warm, sweet, and full-bodied in a way you'd never expect if all you know is bottled milk. It coats your mouth like velvet and settles into your belly like a hug. You sigh. You might be tired, but at least you're tired with calcium. Here's your common historical fact. In medieval Europe, most peasants didn't drink a lot of fresh milk, at least not daily. Why? Because adult digestion of lactose was hit or miss, and because milk spoiled quickly. Most milk was processed into butter or cheese as quickly as possible. But in rural settings like yours, a bit of warm milk in the morning was still a deeply comforting treat, especially for children, elders, or the recently ill. It wasn't trendy, it wasn't pasteurized, but it was yours. There's a small dish by the door of the barn. You pour a little into it for the cat, an unspoken agreement that keeps the mice population on notice. The cat doesn't thank you, but then again, she's a cat. She merely acknowledges your existence with one slow blink. You take what's left of the pail back toward the house. By now, the kitchen fire is awake again. Your cousin is poking at the embers with a stick and muttering something about oatcakes. You set the pail down on the table, and without a word, someone grabs a ladle and pours a bit into a wooden bowl. You're not sure what this is yet. Breakfast. A mid-morning pause, a snack in disguise. Someone tears off a hunk of day-old rye bread and dips it into the milk. It soaks, softens, and disappears into their mouth like it never existed. You follow suit. Suddenly it's delicious. The sourness of the rye, the sweetness of the milk, the hint of ash from the fire, and the ghost of garlic from someone's fingers. It's messy and strange and perfect. You've invented a new meal, milk-soaked bread with a hint of practicality. There's a name for this kind of thing in some places: milksop or bread and milk, depending on the region. It was simple, humble, and beloved by both peasants and kings, though the king's version probably came with cinnamon and gold leaf. Because of course it did. But yours is better. It has mud on the spoon, it has character. Now for today's odd side note: in certain households, the cream was skimmed off the morning milk and saved in little crocks, not for butter, but to be eaten raw, sprinkled with herbs, or even spread on hard bread like an early medieval clotted cream. It wasn't always safe, and it wasn't always popular, but when done right, it was the kind of luxury that made your day feel just a little less gray. You've had it once, long ago. Your aunt made it and called it cow cloud. You thought that was ridiculous, but secretly you agreed. And now for today's scholarly debate. Was dairy truly central to the peasant diet, or was it mostly seasonal and circumstantial? Some historians claim that dairy, especially in Northern Europe, was essential and widespread, even among the lower classes. Others argue that the unpredictability of animal health, weather, and storage meant that fresh milk was an occasional treat, not a staple. You trust the cow. She's never lied to you. Someone knocks over the bowl. A little milk spills onto the hearth. The cat makes her move. The moment is over. But your belly is full. Your arms are sore. And for a brief flicker in time, you felt like a tiny lord sipping warmth from a wooden cup while the wind clawed at the windows outside. Not bad for a morning that started with ox complaints and mud up to your knees. 3 creamy jokes to end this milky tale. Medieval milk, because sometimes the best latte art is just a cow staring at you. It's only clotted if you wait too long, just like your will to keep working. Milk-soaked bread when soup is too ambitious and chewing feels political. There's a knock at the door. Not a sharp, urgent knock, just a lazy tap like someone using one knuckle and a lot of hope. You glance up from the fire where the milk pail has begun to crust over at the rim and shuffle to open it. Outside stands the neighbor boy, maybe 12, maybe a little older. He's holding a small cloth pouch with both hands and looking like it might explode. You open the door wider and he thrusts it out. For your cousin, he mumbles. She traded eggs for it last week. You take it gingerly, untie the cord, and peek inside. The weight, the texture, the way it clumps at the corners. Ooh, salt. Your eyebrows go up. You look at the boy. He shrugs and bolts. Inside, everyone gathers. It's not a gold coin, but it might as well be. You pass the pouch around like a relic. A few grains spill out onto the table, sparkling faintly in the early light. Salt. Real salt. Not smoked ash or crushed wild herbs. Not briny puddle scrapings, but actual crystalline white gold. This right here is about to change everything. Because today, dear listener, we talk about the forgotten luxury of the medieval breakfast table salt and why it could make or break your barley. Here's your factual snack of the day. In the Middle Ages, salt was essential and expensive. It preserved meat-flavored porridge and was a major component in survival strategies, especially before refrigeration, which, to be fair, wouldn't show up for another 800 years or so. Entire towns grew rich from salt production. Wars were fought over salt rights, and in some places laborers were even paid partially in salt, hence the root of the word salary. But for you it means breakfast is about to get interesting. Someone quickly pinches a bit into the barley porridge bubbling over the hearth. Another rubs some on the crust of a rye loaf like they're seasoning a sacred text. A third dares to sprinkle it directly onto a poached parsnip like the most daring of food alchemists. Lo, the difference is immediate. You take a spoonful of barley. Still hot, still thick, still vaguely brown, but now there's a brightness, a balance, a spark of something you hadn't noticed you were missing. It's not just the salt, it's the reminder you're still allowed pleasure. Even here in a world of sour bread and bean stew, a few grains of salt can turn survival into satisfaction. Now for the quirky detail of the morning. In some parts of Europe, particularly in alpine regions and places with access to mineral springs, salt was gathered through elaborate evaporation methods and formed into cakes or wheels. These were traded with lowland villages, often under guard like treasure convoys. Salt merchants were a known breed, respected, resented, and always watched carefully. There's a rumor that one passed through your village once. Left a pouch behind in a gamble never returned. That's where your cousin got this one, won it in a wager over who could milk a goat fastest. She always was lucky with livestock. You dip your finger into the pouch, then into your mouth. Sharp, clean, like biting the ocean but friendlier. And that's the thing salt made even the worst food edible. Without it, your porridge was just sadness in a bowl. Your beans tasted like the inside of a boot. Even your preserved meats, if you were fortunate enough to have any, needed a boost after sitting in a crock for 6 months. Salt wasn't seasoning, it was hope. Which brings us to the academic squabble of the day. Was salt truly rare for peasants, or have we over-romanticized its scarcity? Some argue that while salt was expensive, it was still accessible in small quantities, often bartered, gifted, or used sparingly in communal meals. Others insist that for the lower classes, salt was a feast day item at best, hoarded for preserving pork and used with great caution. Your experience somewhere in between. You've gone months with nothing but ashes and herb blends. But you've also had weeks like now when a pinch of salt was the difference between drudgery and joy. You think back to the last winter when someone in the village salted a fish, then forgot about it for a month. When they found it again, it had turned into something hard, chewy, and oddly delightful. It fed 5 people and no one got sick. That's the power of salt. There are even superstitions about it. Spilling salt, bad luck. Tossing it over your shoulder, protection. Sharing it with a neighbor, a lifelong bond. You look across the table now. The pouch has gone around once and everyone's eyes are just a little brighter. The porridge is just a little less beige, the turnip has edge. Someone leans back and says, "This tastes like what I thought it would taste like." You nod. It's a small victory, but it counts. By mid-morning, the pouch is tucked away again, wrapped in cloth, hidden in the cupboard behind the stale oatcakes. It will last weeks if you're careful. Maybe longer. And every time you use it, you'll remember today, the salt morning, the day the barley smiled back. 3 grainy jokes for your salty delight, medieval salt. Because flavor was not optional, it was aspirational. Share your salt, share your soul, unless it's the last pinch. Salt, the difference between edible and emotional damage. The clouds have thickened into a heavy woolen sky, the kind that promises rain but delivers only the feeling of damp laundry that's been left out too long. The fields are quiet for now. The plow work paused while someone figures out why the ox yoke has started creaking like an offended church door, which means it's time for the mid-morning chew. And nothing says mid-morning chew like beans. Hard beans, dry beans, beans that rattle in your pocket like coins you can't spend. You reach into your satchel and pull out a cloth pouch. Inside, a handful of boiled broad beans, slightly wrinkled, faintly mushy, and absolutely dependable. You pop one into your mouth, chew thoughtfully, and immediately regret trying to use your back molars. Because let's be honest, these beans could chip stone. Here's your popular historical truth of the day. In the medieval peasants' diet, beans were a cornerstone, not a side dish. They were cheap, filling, protein-packed, and shelf-stable, everything you could ever want in a breakfast, lunch, dinner, or existential snack. Broad beans, lentils, field peas, they all found their way into porridges, pies, and pastes. But today you're eating them plain. Boiled yesterday, reboiled this morning, seasoned with a little salt and the desperate hope that someone remembered to soak them first. Spoiler, they didn't. You bite again, more carefully this time. The outer skin splits with a quiet pop, revealing a starchy core that tastes like damp history. It's earthy, mealy, and despite the risk to your dental integrity, actually satisfying. There's something calming about chewing something that once looked like a stone and now acts like a sponge. Your cousin joins you on the log bench, teeth already working through her own handful of bean bombs. Broke a tooth on one of these last month, she says, mouth half full. Swallowed it, never found out if it came back. You nod in solidarity, that sounds about right. Let's talk texture for a moment. Modern meals obsess over creamy, crispy, fluffy. But medieval beans were about density. They weren't so much eaten as conquered. You didn't nibble. You engaged in combat. And yet you came back to them every time. Because despite the occasional dental crisis, beans meant survival. They stored well through winter. They grew in poor soil. They didn't require precious livestock feed. And they filled your belly like warm bricks with slightly musical side effects. Speaking of which, someone down the bench coughs loudly to cover it. No one makes eye contact. The wind picks up as if in sympathy. You all pretend it didn't happen. Here's your odd detail of the day. In certain parts of Europe, especially Italy and France, bean dishes were associated with the dead. On All Souls' Day, people left bowls of beans on graves. Some believed the souls of the departed would eat them. Others just thought it was polite. Either way, it meant beans were more than just a food. They were spiritual, symbolic, slightly spooky. You wonder for a moment if the bean you just dropped in the mud will be eaten by a ghost. You decide to let it be. Ghosts deserve fiber too. Now for your open scholarly debate. Did medieval peasants suffer constant health problems from eating so many beans? Or is that a myth amplified by modern digestive snobbery? Some argue that without proper preparation, soaking, boiling, seasoning beans could cause significant discomfort. Others say that medieval guts were well trained with microbiomes tough enough to handle roughage that would terrify a modern kombucha drinker. You're undecided. Some days beans sit peacefully. Other days you feel like there's a war waging in your belly. Today seems okay. You'll check again in an hour. Someone offers you a bit of vinegar from a small clay flask. You drizzle a drop or two onto the last of your beans. The flavor sharpens. The mush softens. You chew, and for a moment it almost feels like delicacy. This is the good life, someone mutters. You all laugh, not because it's a joke, because it's true. You're outside. The breeze is mild, the beans are warm, the ox hasn't kicked anyone in hours, no one's singing, but no one's complaining either. And that, in medieval terms, is basically a festival. You pop the last bean into your mouth, suck the vinegar from your fingertips, and lean back against the fence. You're full. You're alert. Your teeth are mostly intact. You're ready for the next round of mud and sweat. But before that, just a minute more in this moment. You deserve it. 3 musical little bean jokes to rattle around with beans, because sometimes flavor is less important than lasting impressions. One man's breakfast is another man's percussion instrument. In medieval times, toot wasn't just a horn sound, it was a survival technique. The church bell rings in the distance once, twice, then silence. It's not quite noon, but the sound rolls over the fields like a gentle reminder today is not like the others. You glance toward the house where the hearth smoke rises thin and slow. There's no stew pot simmering, no smell of fat crackling in a pan, just steam from the cauldron warming up another batch of grain, and the quiet clink of wooden spoons being stirred without enthusiasm. Today is a fast day. And that means one thing: no meat, no dairy, no eggs, and no complaining. Well, maybe a little complaining, quietly, internally, with a dramatic sigh or two for emphasis. But outwardly you nod, you fast, and you eat your modified breakfast with the solemn joy of a person pretending that a mashed turnip is a feast. Let's start with your historical truth of the day. In the medieval Christian calendar, fast days were frequent and serious business. Entire weeks lent Advent Ember Days. Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays were designated for abstinence. That meant no animal products of any kind. No butter, no lard, no cheese, no bacon hiding under barley, not even a sneaky splash of milk in your morning porridge. For nobles and monks, this often became a game of culinary innovation. Ritual for peasants. It meant you got very creative with roots, grains, and hope. Today's breakfast. A bowl of turnip mash served lukewarm with a drizzle of garlic broth and what may or may not be crushed chickpeas pretending to be cheese. You stir it with a wooden spoon that has seen better decades. It's fine. Okay, that's generous. It's terrible. But it's fast day. You take a bite anyway. Here's your odd medieval workaround. To make fast days feel less like punishment and more like pious challenge. Peasants developed their own versions of rich foods using plant-based ingredients. You couldn't have meat fine. You shaped mashed peas into patties, added onion and herbs, and pan-fried them in oil if you had any. You couldn't have butter fine again. You boiled almond meal into a smooth paste, added vinegar, and called it a sauce. You couldn't have eggs. You already know about the fake ones. Breakfast was no exception. Your cousin once made a breakfast cake using oat flour, dried apples, and mashed beans. Fried on a slate slab over the fire. You still don't know what it was supposed to be, but you remember the texture: chewy, mildly offensive, and oddly comforting. Like a hug from a person who doesn't like you very much. You're chewing now carefully because today's mash contains bits of wild radish, which are notorious for hiding unpeeled surprises. The garlic broth helps. It's thin but flavorful. You can taste ash time and possibly regret. Across the table, someone chuckles. They've shaped their mash into a tiny pig and are pretending to feed it grains. Someone else joins in, adding 2 barley ears. You laugh despite yourself. You're all hungry, but you're still playful. That counts for something. The beauty of fast day breakfast is their inventiveness. The need to follow rules, however, reluctantly creates a kind of silent competition. Who can make the most convincing mock food? Who found the most colorful turnip this week? Who smuggled in forbidden butter and is pretending it's candle wax? Not you, of course. You'd never do that. But you do know a guy. Now, for today's scholarly tug-of-war, were medieval peasants strictly observant of fast days, or was it more symbolic compliance? Some historians argue that enforcement was localized and uneven. Many rural communities fasted in spirit but made quiet compromises. Others cite records showing fines or penance for meat consumption on fast days, especially in towns where ecclesiastical presence was stronger. You suspect the truth lies somewhere between theology and turnips. Out here in the fields, survival was often holier than doctrine. You respected the rhythm, observed the customs, but if someone offered you a slice of bacon behind the barn, you probably didn't say no. You just chewed quietly and crossed yourself afterward. You take another bite. The mash has cooled now, it's denser, more honest. Someone pours warm oat broth into a cup and passes it around. You take a sip. It's grainy, a bit sour, but oddly calming. Like drinking a memory of breakfast rather than breakfast itself. You glance outside. The sky is brightening. There's work to do. But for now, this quiet meal shared without butter or meat or anything remotely celebratory feels like an anchor. Sometimes fasting isn't about the food. It's about slowing down, listening, making jokes out of radishes and carving pigs out of disappointment. And tomorrow you might have sausage, or at least think about it longingly. 3 humble laughs for your holy hunger fast day breakfast, because penance is more fun with parsnips. Garlic broth like holy water but tastier. When life gives you roots, mash them and pretend they're luxurious. The sound of a wooden spoon hitting the side of a clay bowl is usually harmless. Today it's war. You've ruined it again, your cousin hisses, eyebrows furrowed, eyes narrow. It's too thick. You glance at the bowl in question. It looks fine, warm. Steam rises from the surface like a friendly ghost. The barley sits with just enough slump to prove it's not dry, not soupy, just porridge. I like it thick, you mumble. It sticks to the ribs. It sticks to the spoon, she retorts, holding up the utensil like it's a medieval crime exhibit. You can cut this with a knife. You reach across the fire pit and retrieve a second bowl ladled from the same pot, but with the extra splash of water you insisted on adding. Your cousin grimaces. Now it's gruel. It's not porridge. It's a puddle with ambition. Thus begins the morning's episode of the porridge arguments, a cherished and absurd family tradition. 'Cause in your world, porridge isn't just breakfast, it's identity, it's expression, it's an edible hill to die on. Let's start with your common historical fact of the day. Porridge, also known as pottage, mash, gruel, or whatever's in the pot, was the foundation of peasant meals for centuries. Grain plus liquid plus heat, survival, oats, barley, millet, even cracked rye, anything could become porridge. Add vegetables, herbs, or a stolen onion and you had dinner. Add dried fruit, almond milk, or honey and you had something dangerously close to joy. But in the morning it was serious business, and everyone had an opinion. Too thick, it was chewy like eating regret. Too thin, it was drinkable sadness. Not stirred enough, you got lumps. Stirred too much, it turned to paste. And heaven forbid someone added beans. Today's pot contains barley and a whisper of oat boiled slowly in yesterday's vegetable broth. Someone tossed in a pinch of salt, probably with flair, and there are visible green flecks that may or may not be parsley. The problem, as always, is consistency. Your cousin wants scoopable, you want slurpable. The toddler in the corner wants throwable. And that's the thing about porridge, it invites debate. Because it's not just food, it's comfort disguised as a science experiment. You spoon a mouthful into your bowl. It sits gently, a bit soupy around the edges. You taste it warm, savory, a little sweet from the carrots someone forgot to cut small. It's good, not spectacular, but honest. Across the fire, your cousin has added extra dried bread to her portion to fix it. Now it looks like porridge casserole. She seems smug. Here's your quirky porridge detail. In some households, porridge wasn't just eaten fresh. It was left to cool, congeal, and be sliced the next day like a grain loaf. It could be fried in a pan, taken into the fields, or fed to livestock if it had offended too many people. In Italy, a version of this still exists, polenta pasticciata, sliced and fried. But you just called it the gray brick, and somehow it always showed up again. The porridge argument escalates. Someone says adding onions is heresy. Someone else insists that dried pear slices elevate the dish into culinary poetry. The old man by the fire mutters, "In my day we ate it plain and were glad for it," which is rich coming from someone currently buttering his bowl with a chunk of garlic. A spoon is dropped. A child cries. Someone throws a barley grain at someone else's head. A good morning. You sip your porridge with quiet pride. It's still warm, still yours, still just right. Now for today's academic hot take, was medieval porridge a staple out of love or necessity? Some argue that it was universally beloved, easy to cook, endlessly adaptable, and deeply satisfying. Others insist it was merely tolerated, the kind of food you ate because there were no other options. A few brave souls suggest porridge could be both a blank canvas upon which poverty painted either comfort or boredom. You lean toward both. You've had porridge that tasted like hope, and porridge that tasted like wallpaper paste. It all depends on the day, the fire, the salt, the mood. You finish your bowl. The last spoonful is always the best. It's thicker, cooler. It carries every flavor at once: grain, garlic, parsley, smoke, and faint resignation. You look across the fire. Your cousin's bowl is empty. She raises an eyebrow. Still think it should be thinner. You shrug. Still think you should stir less. You both laugh. The porridge truce is declared. Until tomorrow. 3 smooth-textured jokes for your breakfast deliberations. Medieval porridge, where culinary dreams go to simmer and occasionally curdle. It's not a meal, it's a debate with a ladle. Would you like lumps is not a rhetorical question. The sun peeks through the clouds like it's trying to apologize for the damp, and you decide to accept it, mostly because the house is starting to smell like something vaguely sweet. That's not a typo. Sweet. In your world of garlic, salt, beans, and cabbage, that's a rare and suspicious occurrence. You stand near the hearth and sniff again. Yes, definitely something caramelizing, but not sugar, not fruit, not anything expensive enough to inspire guilt. It's root jam, probably turnip, maybe beet, possibly mystery. Either way, you follow the smell. At the far side of the kitchen, your aunt is bent over a flat stone, carefully scraping a sticky golden brown substance into a cracked jar. On the fire behind her, a second pot is bubbling, thicker than broth, slower than stew. She looks up and grins. "Found the old carrots," she says, holding up a shriveled orange root that looks more like a gnome's toe than anything edible. "Boiled them with last autumn's turnip and a bit of apple skin. Jam." You nod solemnly. "Of course, breakfast jam. Made from desperation and creativity. Served on turnip toast naturally. Here's your historical fact of the day. In the medieval world, fruit preserves and root jams existed, though rarely in the way we imagine. Without modern sugar or citrus, peasants made their sweeteners with honey-fermented fruit juice and sometimes reduced wine or must. Carrots, parsnips, and turnips, especially when boiled down, slowly developed natural sweetness. These were mashed, mixed with herbs or nuts, and preserved in clay pots for days when morale needed a little boost. In other words, when life gave you carrots, you made sad marmalade. You sit down at the table just as someone places a tray of turnip toasts nearby. Thick slices of roasted turnip, slightly charred at the edges, rubbed with oil and sprinkled with salt. Praise be to the pouch. They're warm, sturdy, and surprisingly bread-like if you ignore the fact they're made entirely of vegetable and spite. One of the younger kids picks one up, spreads the carrot, apple, turnip paste across the top, and takes a bite. Her eyes widen. "It's like jam," she whispers. "Because it is jam," your aunt mutters. "But it's good. You try it yourself." The toast is earthy, the jam is sweetish, and together they form a breakfast that tastes like someone tried very hard and somehow succeeded. It's no pastry, but it's satisfying in the same way as finding a forgotten coin in your boot. The table grows quiet, not from silence but concentration. Everyone's toasting, spreading, and chewing like it's Sunday dinner. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some households, especially in Germanic and Nordic regions, root jams were flavored with herbs like sage or thyme, creating sweet, savory hybrids that confused the palate but delighted the winter-weary. Others added ground hazelnuts, dried berries, or even a splash of weak beer to mimic the tang of fermented fruit. The result? Something between breakfast and medicine. Your version today lumpy but successful. You taste turnip, a little apple tang, and the ghost of a raisin someone must have dropped in by accident. You make another slice. This time you press the toast into the jam, fold it like a soft sandwich, and chew slowly. The warmth spreads through your chest. It's not just filling, it's oddly cheerful. You wonder for a moment why this isn't a thing more often. And then you remember turnips aren't popular, and time is short. But today both have aligned in your favor. Now for the open academic question. Did medieval peasants enjoy sweet breakfasts regularly, or only as a seasonal treat? Some scholars argue that sweets, even root-based ones, were rare and reserved for holidays, feasts, or special occasions. Others point out that sweetness was more common than we assume, just in less intense forms like stewed apples, boiled raisins, or naturally sweet grains like millet and spelt. Some even suggest that peasant ingenuity led to more experimentation with sweetness, not less. You're inclined to agree with the second camp, not because your breakfast is sophisticated, but because someone here figured out how to turn roots into comfort food. And if that doesn't count as innovation, nothing does. After the toast and jam, someone brings out the last of the nut oil and offers it up for dipping. The oil smells sharp, nutty, and slightly smoky. You dab your toast in it, taste it carefully, and close your eyes. Now that's a proper ending. The fire crackles softly. The jam pot is scraped clean. The turnips have been devoured. Even the skeptical child who usually claims she's not a root person has gone back for thirds. You lean back, belly warm, hands sticky. It wasn't meat, it wasn't cheese, but somehow it was one of the best breakfasts of the week. 3 Swedish jokes to spread over your root toast, turnip toast, because medieval mornings needed a root awakening. Root jam proof that if you boil sadness long enough, it becomes breakfast. Who needs fruit when you've got ambition and a carrot with identity issues? There's a moment just after the sun crests the thatched roofs and before the chickens remember they have grievances, when the house feels suspended in soft golden stillness. The breakfast fire is crackling gently. The pots are quiet for once. Someone is sewing near the window. Someone else is rearranging logs, pretending to be helpful. And then, there it is, the creak. You tilt your head. The sound comes from above. Not loud, just a subtle stretch of rope, a soft sway of something heavy in the rafters. It swings when the door opens. It breathes smoke. It watches you. It's the smoked thing. You don't remember when it first appeared or what it used to be. Ham, sausage, eel. No one's really sure anymore. It's wrapped in cloth dusted with ash and hung near the smoke hole, where it's been absorbing the flavor of every meal, every fire, every argument for at least 3 seasons. No one eats it, not yet. It's waiting. And until then it remains the house's quiet, dangling guardian, the smoked thing hanging above. Let's get your historical fact of the day out of the way. Smoking was one of the primary preservation methods in medieval households, especially in cooler climates. Salted meat or fish, when available, was hung above the hearth, where the constant smoke from the cook fire would slowly dry it out, flavor it, and make it unappetizing to bugs, rodents, and sometimes even humans. These hanging bundles were often the most valuable food items in the home, not because they tasted good, but because they lasted. Through famine, storm, and theological argument, you nudge the bench underneath the rafters and climb up carefully. You poke the thing with a stick. It sways ominously. Someone coughs behind you. Don't touch it, your cousin says. It's not ready. When is it ready, you ask? She shrugs when it tells us. You respect that. Down below, someone's ladling grain porridge into bowls again. But today, in an act of daring, they've shaved off a thin sliver from the smoked thing and tossed it in. The kitchen holds its breath. The sliver curls and sizzles like bark tossed into a fire. The smell that emerges is unlike anything you've ever had in breakfast before. Smoky, yes, but also tangy, sweet, rich, like every meat that's ever passed through this hearth had a secret meeting and voted this one the best. You reach for a spoon. The porridge is still simple barley bean broth, a touch of oil, but now it carries the soul of the smoke. A single sliver and suddenly the whole bowl is telling you stories about old winters and harder years. You chew slowly. The flavor coats your mouth like an edible folk tale. Your cousin grins. One more sliver, not until next week, the old man says sternly. He points upward. That's our guardian angel. You look up. The thing sways again approvingly. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some traditions, especially in Germanic and Nordic households, the smoked item hanging above the hearth was more than just food, it was symbolic. Called the hanging meat, it was often only cut into during feast days, births, or dire need. Some families even named theirs. It became part of the kitchen lore, a culinary time capsule. You once heard of a house where the hanging sausage outlived 3 generations. When they finally ate it, the village held a funeral for it. You kind of get it. By now, the flavor of the sliver has infused the air. The younger children are sniffing their bowls suspiciously, asking if meat has finally returned to the house. The answer, of course, is sort of. Because the smoked thing is a paradox, always present, rarely consumed, a reminder of better days or worse days to come. Breakfast elevated by memory, time for your open academic squabble. Did medieval peasants actually have smoked meats on hand? Or is this a luxury we've retroactively imagined? Some historians argue that rural households regularly smoked meats, especially pork, after seasonal slaughter. Others suggest that access to such resources was limited and reserved for those with larger landholdings or strong community ties. Many agree that smoking was more common than salting in inland areas where salt was scarce. You lean toward believing in the magic, because it's not about having smoked meat every day. It's about having it at all. About knowing it's there hanging waiting, even if you never touch it, even if it turns into leather. Especially if it turns into leather, you finish your porridge. The smoky tang lingers on your tongue. You feel satisfied, like you've been trusted with a secret. The fire cracks. The thing above doesn't move now. It's resting, digesting the attention. Outside, the oxen are lowing again, and someone yells about a bucket that's gone missing. Another workday begins, but for a moment, just one moment, the whole house feels full. All because of the shadow overhead. 3 smoky morsels of breakfast humor of the smoked thing, because every house needs a food item with a personality. Technically edible, emotionally sacred. Nothing says medieval luxury like meat you're not allowed to eat. The world is slow to wake this morning. The clouds haven't moved, the chickens haven't argued yet, and the fire in the hearth is still deciding whether it wants to live or not. You sit at the long table wrapped in a blanket that smells like old hay and slightly burnt soup, staring at a stubby candle that flickers just enough to remind you it exists. This is what breakfast looks like today, quiet, dim, almost private. It's too early for sun, too cold for chatter. But the candle is here and so are you, and the porridge doesn't know any better. Welcome to Breakfast by Candlelight Medieval Edition. You spoon slowly. The porridge is thicker today with bits of chestnut and dried greens and a layer of something unidentifiable on top. It could be oat scum. It could be flavor. You're too tired to question it. Across the table, your cousin lights another stub of wax. The glow grows a little, enough to see the steam from your bowl drift upward in soft, sleepy ribbons. Outside, the roosters are still on their first cup of crow. The frost has not yet surrendered to the day. And inside, the kitchen feels like a cocoon of smoke silence and grain-based consistency. Here's your historical fact of the morning. In much of medieval Europe, especially in winter, people often began their days in darkness with only a candle or a smoldering hearth to light their meals. Oil lamps were rare, windows were tiny, sunlight was seasonal. If you wanted light, you had to burn something wax tallow resin-soaked twigs or your patience. So breakfast wasn't just a meal, it was a shadow play. You ate by flicker. You chewed in half-light. You shared warmth more than words. And candles weren't cheap. A beeswax candle could cost more than a week of bread. Tallow was cheaper, made from animal fat, but it stank when it burned and left soot on the ceiling. Still, when it was cold and dark and your stomach groaned louder than the church bell, you lit one anyway. Because even in hunger, we crave glow. You look at the candle now. The wax pools around its base like a miniature moat. Someone poked a hole in a piece of bread and shoved the stub inside. That's your makeshift candle holder, a crouton of fire safety. It works, sort of. The bread begins to sizzle. You ignore it. Here's your quirky candle fact. In some households, bread wasn't just for eating. It was used as insulation padding and even as candle bases. Hard crusts were hollowed out and filled with wax. Some families called them supper lights, and children were warned not to nibble them mid-glow. Not that the warning helped. You once ate half a candle trying to prove a point. Your cousin still brings it up. The candle sputters. You lean closer, catching a better look at your bowl. There's a chunk of roasted parsnip floating near the top like a sleepy iceberg. You spear it with your spoon and chew. It's soft, buttery, and slightly smoked from last night's fire. Perfect. Your cousin pours a bit of hot water into her mug and drops in a sliver of dried apple. She hands you another. You sip. The water tastes faintly fruity, just enough to pretend you're drinking something more luxurious than boiled disappointment. Across the table, the old man clears his throat. Used to have breakfast with music, he says suddenly. Cousin played the flute. Badly. Still made the food warmer. You smile, not because it's funny, but because it's true. Everything tastes better with a little light, a little sound, a little company. Even turnip broth, even gray porridge, even the half-burned chunk of garlic floating near your spoon right now. You take another sip of apple water and sigh. Warmth spreads down your throat like a promise. It's not much, but it's enough. Here's your open scholarly debate of the day. Were early medieval breakfasts solitary rituals or communal affairs? Some scholars suggest morning meals were quiet, even spiritual, taken before work, before noise, with minimal conversation. Others argue that families often ate together, especially in rural homes where space was shared and meals were prepared collectively. You've experienced both. Some mornings are sacred silences. Others are chaos with a side of lentils. Today is somewhere in between. The candle gutters low. The bread base collapses with a soft whump, extinguishing the flame in a little puff of smoke and toast. No one moves to replace it. The sun is finally pushing through the fog. The room brightens with dull certainty. Breakfast is over. Someone begins clearing bowls. Someone else kicks the hearth into waking. The day has officially begun. But for a moment, one quiet, flickering moment, you had a soft light, a warm mug and food that didn't demand anything from you except presence. 3 flickering candle jokes for your gently glowing breakfast by candlelight, because nothing says romance like barley and exhaustion. Tallow candles, the only breakfast item that smells worse when lit. If your candle's in bread, it's not a meal, it's performance art. The barn door groans like it's waking from a long, disappointing nap. You push it open with your shoulder, the frost-covered hinges complaining the whole way. Inside, the morning light leaks through slats in golden streaks, dust floating like sleepy fireflies. You blink, rub your arms, and brace for the smell. There it is, warm hay, damp earth, animal breath, and something vaguely philosophical. You step in, fully boots crunching across straw, and they look up at you. The oxen, 2 of them. Massive, slow, and deeply unimpressed by your punctuality. They shift their weight, snort a little, and stare like you've interrupted a very intense conversation about mud. You nod respectfully. It's breakfast time, but not for you. It's for them. Here's your truth of the day. In peasant life, feeding the animals often came before feeding yourself, especially beasts of burden like oxen, who not only helped you plow, transport, and occasionally intimidate strangers, but also were literally the engines of your survival. They ate first, always. Because if they didn't eat, you didn't work. And if you didn't work, you didn't eat. It was an elegant little spiral of dependence and hay. You grab the pitchfork and head toward the feed pile. Not fancy stuff, mostly oat husks, some chaff, a bit of wilted clover, and a bonus apple peel if someone felt generous. You toss it into the trough in practiced rhythm. The oxen sniff, snort, and begin munching with all the urgency of old men chewing politics. You lean on the pitchfork and watch them eat. It's strange, really, how calm it is in here. No arguments, no porridge debates, no "you call this soup" commentary from the peanut gallery. Just chewing. Heavy, slow, meditative chewing. One of them lets out a long sigh through its nose, like even digestion is a form of reflection. You wonder sometimes what they think about. Do they dream of greener fields? Do they recognize which days are feast days? Do they silently judge your taste in oats? Probably, especially the last one. Here's your quirky detail. In some regions, particularly in the British Isles and Central Europe, it was customary to bless the oxen during certain feast days, especially around Plough, Monday, or the beginning of Lent. A priest might sprinkle holy water on them. Children might adorn their horns with ribbons. Families would offer them extra feed, barley mash, sometimes even bread with salt as a thank you for their year-round service. You once tried to decorate your ox with a flower crown. He ate it. After they finished their meal, you give their thick necks a slow pat. Their hides are coarse, warm, and slightly crusted with last week's rain. One of them shifts to let you scratch behind his ear. It's a good moment, no urgency, just quiet care. And this is where your breakfast truly begins. Not at the hearth, not with the porridge, but here with full oxen and a sense of earned pause. You sit on the overturned bucket near the wall and pull out your own food. Not much, just a slice of barley bread wrapped in cloth, a leftover turnip patty, and a small flask of warm ale. You chew slowly, watching the oxen breathe clouds into the morning light. They're content, you're tired. But there's a calm here that the kitchen rarely gives. Time for the scholarly tension of the day. Did medieval peasants truly prioritize animals over themselves out of ritual, or was it simple necessity? Some historians argue that feeding livestock first was a deeply ingrained moral structure, an extension of stewardship and harmony with nature. Others suggest it was just practical. Hungry animals are cranky, loud, and bad at plowing. You keep them fed so they don't die or destroy the fence. You suspect it's both. Practicality often becomes morality when repeated enough times. And in a world built on cycles of seasons, labor, hunger, and repair, putting the ox first is a way of saying, we're still part of something bigger than ourselves. You finish your meal. The bread was dry, the turnip had attitude, the ale was lukewarm. But somehow, eaten here among straw and snorts and slow chewers, it tastes better than most things. You stand, stretch, and start brushing down the oxen with a worn bundle of twigs. They grumble in appreciation. You don't rush. There's a rhythm to it all. Feed, clean, work, rest, feed, work again. A simple contract rewritten each morning in hay and steam and scratchy fur. One of the oxen sneezes. It echoes through the rafters like a barn-sized trumpet solo. You laugh. He does not. Balance restored. 3 slow-chewing jokes for your oxen breakfast interlude. Feed the ox before yourself. He deserves it. You're just here for plot development. Breakfast with oxen, quieter but heavier on the existential side-eye. They say you are what you eat. These guys must be 80% hay, 20% judgment. The smell hits you before you even reach the kitchen, an unmistakable blend of sour grain, warm wood, and something vaguely vinegary with a hint of mushrooms. Sock's old ambition. You stop just outside the door and blink. Oh no, you murmur. It's back. The fermented mash. Inside, your cousin is hunched over a ceramic crock. The lid ajar, steam curling upward like it's trying to escape the consequences of its own creation. She looks up at you. Face triumphant, cheeks flushed. It's ready, she says, like announcing the arrival of royalty. Or plague. You step in. The smell wraps around you like an overly enthusiastic acquaintance. You brace yourself. She stirs the mash with a carved wooden spoon and it lets out a glurp like an old man standing up too fast. Thick, slightly frothy and dotted with something pale and gelatinous, it doesn't scream breakfast. It screams alchemy. Still you sit down, because this is breakfast, and this is family, and because deep down you're curious. Here's your historical fact of the day. In the medieval world, fermentation was everywhere and not just in wine or ale. Grains were soaked, soured, left in warm corners to bubble and expand into mashes, gruels, and occasionally bready puddings of questionable temperament. Sometimes this was intentional. Sometimes it was the result of forgetting a pot in the corner for 3 days and discovering something alive. But fermented mash wasn't a failure. It was survival with flair. It kept longer. It was easier to digest. It had that tangy, comforting, slightly chaotic flavor that made you feel like you were eating something powerful, ancestral, like it knew something you didn't. Your cousin ladles some into a bowl and sets it in front of you. The mash jiggles slightly. She smiles. You do not, but you take a bite. It's warm, tart, soft in the middle and a little crusty around the edges from being reheated near the fire. There's barley in there definitely, maybe oat, and something green, wild fennel maybe, or moss. The flavor is sour, yes, but oddly addictive, like biting into a memory, like breakfast with attitude. You raise an eyebrow. Not bad, you say, surprised. I added beer mash, she says proudly. You nod. That explains the fizz. Here's your quirky medieval tidbit. In some monastic and rural traditions, fermented grain mash was considered a healing food, especially for children, the elderly, or anyone with a cold stomach, which in medieval terms meant everything from indigestion to general melancholy. It was believed to balance the humors and encourage gentle motion of the bowels, which is perhaps the most medieval way of saying you'll be busy later. You remember once, after a particularly bad winter cough, your grandmother fed you hot soured millet mash with mint and a splash of honey? It worked. You were better the next day. Or maybe you were just too afraid to ask for seconds. The mash begins to cool in your bowl, the surface forming a thin skin. You break it with your spoon, stirring gently, watching steam rise. Outside, someone is arguing with the ox again. Inside, the fire pops softly. The fermented mash sits heavy in your belly in that comforting way that says you won't be hungry until the moon comes up. Your cousin is now adding more mash to a cloth-lined pot. Gonna shape it and bake it later, she says. Make a crusty cake. You nod. Fermented mash never dies, it just changes form. Time for the academic debate of the day. Did fermented grain dishes form a meaningful part of the peasant diet, or were they an occasional improvisation? Some historians argue these mashes were a dietary staple, economical, healthful, and full of calories. Others suggest they were fallback foods used when fresher grains or leavened bread weren't possible. But in practice, you ate what was bubbling. And if it didn't bite you back, you called it breakfast. The old man shuffles in and sniffs the air. His nose wrinkles. That again. Your cousin beams. You want some? He stares at the pot, considers, and finally shrugs. Put it in a bowl. I don't want to hurt its feelings. He sits beside you. You both eat in silence. The mash is sour, warm, and weirdly satisfying. A fermented beginning to a long, earthy day. Outside, the wind shifts. The sky turns a brighter gray. The ox gives up and walks toward the plow. The wheelbarrow creaks like it has opinions. And you're full, alert, and slightly concerned about what's happening inside your stomach, but in a good way. You wipe your bowl clean with a crust of rye bread. The mash has done its job. A little ancient, a little strange, but exactly what you needed. 3 tangy jokes to stir into your bubbling bowl, fermented mash breakfast that eats you back. Medieval probiotics, we call it whatever's in the pot. If it hisses when you stir it, it's either ready or angry. The sun has finally decided to act like it belongs here, casting long amber beams across the courtyard and making the frost on the wooden beams glisten like sugar. Someone's laid out a rough bit of linen across a flat stone slab, and on top of it rows of shiny reddish-brown strips catching the light like edible parchment. You walk over drawn by the smell, sweet, tart, a little sticky, a little wild. Your cousin grins from behind the makeshift drying rack fingers coated in a thin layer of syrup and smugness. Fruit leather, she says. You raise an eyebrow. That's not leather, she snorts. Tell that to the plum that gave its life. Let's begin with your historical truth of the day. In the medieval countryside, especially in areas with access to orchards, hedgerows, or generous neighbors, fruit preservation was a quiet miracle. Without refrigeration, sugary jam, or airtight jars, people turned to the sun, the wind, and sheer stubbornness to transform fresh fruit into something durable. Enter fruit leather, also called fruit sheets, fruit parchment, or compote paste. These chewy strips were made by mashing cooked fruit into pulp, sometimes with a dash of honey. Sometimes just wild fermentation and spreading it into thin layers to dry on boards, cloth, or clay tiles. Days later, when they had firmed up and darkened, you rolled them, folded them, or sliced them into thin ribbons. They were tart, a little tough, but full of sunshine when winter came knocking. You tear off a piece and hold it to the light, translucent, speckled with seeds, possibly some hay. You chew. The texture is delightfully medieval, uneven, sticky, and just flexible enough to make your jaw work for it. The flavor, though, rich plum, a hint of sour apple, maybe a whisper of black currant, is something rare. It's joyful. You chew slowly, eyes closed, letting it melt on your tongue like a forgotten summer. Here's your odd medieval tidbit. In parts of Eastern Europe and the Levant, fruit leather wasn't just food, it was medicine. Dried sour cherry or apricot sheets were used as digestive aids or appetite stimulants. In some monasteries, it was served with herb broth as a tonic. In Armenia and Georgia, tlapi sour fruit rolls are still made today using nearly the same techniques. Your cousin says this batch came from the last of the autumn plums boiled with a few too-wrinkled apples and a generous helping of dried crab apples. She points to one sheet that's darker than the rest. That one has nettles in it. You pause mid-chew. She shrugs for the gut. In your house, fruit leather isn't something that happens often. It's seasonal magic. A rare moment when fruit fire and time align. The strips are dried near the hearth or sun-dried when the weather cooperates. Wrapped in cloth, hidden in crocks. Saved for days when nothing else is sweet and you need a memory of orchard wind. You take another bite. This one has a bit of pear in it, judging by the grainy texture. Someone's gone fancy. Time for your open academic debate. How common were preserved fruit products among medieval peasants? Some scholars argue that fruit drying was practiced widely in regions with surplus or access to trade. Others suggest it was a luxury reserved for households with time tools or orchards of their own. Written records often mention fruit preserves in noble settings, but evidence from archaeology shows sun-dried fruits were also used by common folk, especially in areas rich with wild berries or crab apples. You don't care much for the debate today. You've got plum pulp stuck in your teeth and a smile on your face. Someone brings over a pot of warm water infused with mint and pours it into a wooden cup. You sip it slowly, letting the tart, sweet fruit leather finish its slow dissolve while the warmth of the tea seeps into your chest. Across the table, your younger cousin is trying to peel a strip off the cloth backing. It sticks, rips, and she ends up chewing the whole thing, fabric bits and all. You don't stop her. She'll figure it out. You remember once years ago you had fruit leather on a feast day. A rare delicacy rolled with crushed hazelnuts and honey. It was handed out in tiny scrolls like edible manuscripts. You carried yours in your pouch for 3 days before daring to eat it. When you did, it was hard as a roof tile but still tasted like sunlight. That's what this is, edible sunlight. You finish your strip, stretch your arms, and reach for another. Don't get greedy, your cousin warns. You respond the only way that makes sense with your mouth full of plums and pride. 3 chewy jokes to roll with medieval fruit leather because you deserve a snack and a workout at the same time. It's not sticky, it's historically accurate. Technically not candy, but your teeth won't know the difference. You lift the lid off the little wooden chest near the hearth. A draft of cold air sneaks in behind you and the smell wafting up punches you square in the memory. You blink. Pause. Then smile carefully. It's not bad, not good either, but definitely recognizable. You reach in and pull out a cloth bundle tied with a twist of old twine. You loosen it, unwrap it layer by layer like a gift from the ghost of breakfast past, and inside lies your prize. A lump of last week's barley loaf stew hybrid. Half bread, half soup, all legacy. Someone left it to cool. Someone forgot to reheat it. Now it's somewhere between a snack and a fossil. You give it a tentative sniff. Still edible. Technically. You've found yourself in that most sacred of peasant culinary traditions. The leftovers of last week. Here's your historical fact of the day. In medieval peasant households, food waste wasn't just discouraged, it was practically unthinkable. Everything was reused. Bones became broth, bread became pudding, porridge became fry cakes. Even scraps of vegetables were boiled into thin stews stretched out with herbs or wild greens. Leftovers weren't leftovers, they were ingredients with a head start. And that thing in your hand, it's seen 3 meals and at least 1 argument. You place the lump near the fire to warm, nestling it in the crook of the iron pan. It hisses a little. A good sign. The outer crust begins to soften its texture, shifting from brick to chewable possibility. Nearby, your cousin adds a splash of yesterday's broth to her own plate of scraps. Someone else crumbles the last of last week's dried lentil cake into a pot. A few turnip peelings, some bean mash, a bit of old sauerkraut, and just like that, you've got something new. Not fancy, but nourishing. Honest food with a long memory. You finally take a bite. The crust gives way to a soft, herby center. There's barley, of course, an onion, and something sweet you weren't expecting, maybe dried plum or a piece of carrot that refused to surrender its cheer. It's dense, flavorful, and oddly comforting. There's history in every chew. You're not eating a meal, you're eating a timeline. Here's your quirky leftover detail. In many medieval kitchens, leftovers were deliberately layered and saved, sometimes even named. Some called them scrap pies, reboiled dinners, or poor man's pastes. In German-speaking regions, there's record of a dish, literally called Reste-Suppe, leftover soup, a kind of culinary catch-all that evolved throughout the week. In some households, the final Friday mashup meal was so elaborate, it became a tradition. All the week's edible ghosts gathered in one pot, simmered together, and served with vinegar and bread. Some families even had designated leftover spoons, flattened and wider to deal with unpredictable textures. You kind of want one. Today's mashup becomes a shared ritual. Everyone brings their bits. One person has half a fried cake. Another found the corner of a lentil and parsnip tart in the bottom of a sack. Even the toddler contributes a very sticky strip of fruit leather that somehow ends up in the pot. You taste the result. It's strange, it's sour, it's perfect. Now for the open academic debate. Did peasants plan meals with leftovers in mind, or was it pure improvisation? Some argue that dishes like pottage and stew were always meant to be flexible containers of opportunity rather than recipes. Others believe that while improvisation was common, there were clear expectations and standard follow-ups. Yesterday's porridge became oatcakes, old bread became broth thickener, and leftover mash was fried at dawn. You suspect it was both. Improvised, yes, but also familiar. Predictable in its unpredictability. A system of edible recycling where flavor came from age, not just spice. Your spoon scrapes the bottom of the bowl. Someone offers you a second helping. You glance at the pot, it's half full, bubbling quietly like it's remembering something. You nod. Another bowl, why not? After all, how often do you get to eat 6 days of cooking in a single bite? You chew slowly, thoughtfully. It's food, yes, but it's also resilience. Every bit of it had its moment, its own small failure, its own strange beauty. You're not just eating what's left, you're eating what's lasted. 3 reheated jokes to go with your edible archaeology medieval leftovers because flavor improves with time and slight forgetfulness. It's not old food, it's a culinary archive. The best meals are sometimes accidents you refuse to throw away. The sound starts before the sun has finished climbing the barn roof, soft, rhythmic, steady. A kind of thump slosh, followed by a short, breathy grunt. You know this music by heart. Butter is being made. You step into the side room of the cottage, drawn by the beat and the promise of richness. Inside, your aunt is already deep into the morning butter ritual arms. Flexing jaw, set eyes fixed on the churn like it just insulted her family. The butter churn stands like a short, proud barrel, round-bellied, full of cream and vibrating slightly with the effort. She plunges the dasher down and lifts it again over and over. It's a dance. It's a war. It's breakfast. You pull up a stool and sit near the door, soaking in the scent, sour milk, damp wood, a faint breath of smoke from the hearth. A good morning. Here's your historical truth of the day. In the medieval world, especially in the countryside, butter wasn't just food, it was process, ritual, and sometimes luxury. The cream rose to the top of the milk overnight, was skimmed with care and churned by hand for as long as it took. Sometimes hours, sometimes sore shoulders. Always a bit of mystery. You didn't make butter when you wanted to. You made it when the cream said you could. And the result, a yellow lump of effort, community, and edible sunshine. Your aunt pauses to wipe her brow. The churn sloshes one last time, then shifts. The cream begins to separate. You hear the first faint slap of solid against wood. She grins. It's coming, she says. You peer inside. Tiny golden clumps are forming, floating in buttermilk like sleepy clouds. It's happening. Butter is being born. Here's your quirky dairy detail. In some traditions, especially among Northern European peasants, butter making was an almost sacred act accompanied by songs, blessings, and even protective charms. Evil spirits were blamed for stealing the churn when cream refused to thicken. Some families placed iron knives under the churn to ward off bad luck. Others whispered prayers or more practically just cursed loudly until it worked. You once tried to help churn as a child and fell asleep halfway through. The butter curdled. Your cousin still tells the story. Your aunt lifts the lid and pours the buttermilk into a bowl, setting it aside for baking or feeding to pigs. What remains inside the churn is humble but holy, a squat yellow blob glistening with promise. She presses it into shape with a wooden paddle, working the remaining liquid out. The butter squelches politely. You can't help it. You reach out and swipe a fingertip along the edge. The flavor is unreal, creamy, slightly grassy, a hint of barn, like summer fields melted down and made edible. You close your eyes and hum. There's no bread yet, so your aunt tears off a strip of last night's flat cake and hands it to you. You break it in half, still warm from being left too close to the hearth, and slather it with the still soft butter. You take a bite. It's not just food, it's forgiveness. For the cold, for the chores, for the beans yesterday, you chew slowly, reverently. Outside, someone is calling for help with a wheelbarrow. Inside, no one moves. Not until the butter is shaped, salted, and tucked away into a crock lined with wet leaves and cool clay. Only then is the spell broken. Here's your open academic debate. Was butter a peasant staple or a festival treat? Some scholars argue that in Northern Europe, where cows were common and summers short, butter was a regular part of the rural diet. Others suggest it was often traded away, saved for feast days, or used as a cash item not eaten casually. In southern regions, oil took its place and butter became a symbol of northern peasantry, hardy, rustic, a little stubborn. Your household butter is made when it can be, shared when it's there, cherished every time. As the butter cools in the crock, your aunt hums to herself. You finish your flat cake. The warmth lingers in your chest. Tomorrow there may be no butter. Tomorrow it might be just turnip mash and cold oats. But today, you tasted sunlight. 3 soft spread jokes to melt into your morning medieval butter when your only luxury was yellow and slightly wobbly. The churn takes your time. The butter gives it back. You haven't lived until you've had butter with a side of superstition. You don't need a sundial to tell you what time it is. You don't need a bell or a clock or some monastic chant echoing from the valley. You've got the rooster. More precisely, you've got the rooster's opinion. The first crow is tentative, like he's testing the acoustics. The second is louder, annoyed, directed at a rival across the fence. The third one, that's the real one. That's the scream of a feathered alarm clock who resents your existence but still takes his job very seriously. You roll over under your coarse wool blanket and groan. Too early, too loud, too rural. But this is the sound of your world, and breakfast doesn't begin until the rooster says it does. Let's begin with your historical fact of the day. In medieval peasant life, timekeeping was acoustic. Roosters, bells, hoofbeats, hearth crackles, coughing neighbors, and creaky doors. The entire village pulsed with a rhythm of sound, each noise a kind of clock. And the rooster was both herald and nuisance, crowing not at dawn, as modern poets suggest, but multiple times throughout the night and morning, just to be sure you didn't forget he was there. Today's rooster is especially theatrical. He struts along the fence post like a drama king in feathers, cackling insults at the wind, and announcing breakfast like he's been nominated for an award. Your cousin stumbles out behind you, yawns into her sleeve and mutters, "We should eat him." You nod. You first. Inside the kitchen is already coming alive. The fire pops and hisses. Someone is turning oatcakes on the griddle, and layered over it all are the other morning sounds of peasant life. The crack of a stick underfoot, the splash of cold water in a basin, the gentle thunk of a wooden spoon against a bowl, the occasional curse when someone steps on a nail. Even the porridge seems to whisper as it thickens, an edible white noise that marks the passage of time. Here's your quirky sound detail. In some medieval villages, people trained themselves to wake to specific sounds long before alarm clocks. The rooster was just one. Others woke to the baker's footsteps, the priest's early bell, or the splash of milk into a pail. Entire communities ran on auditory patterns, not numbers. You wake to the rooster, and the slightly less poetic thud of your cousin tripping over the firewood stack. Every morning. Today's breakfast is modest, a barley rye mash, reheated from yesterday, topped with fried nettles and a sprinkle of vinegar. It sizzles when it hits the pan, singing its own savory lullaby. You listen, not just eat, because breakfast isn't just food, it's soundtracking the day. Outside, the village begins its own symphony. The smith's hammer taps. A dog barks at a leaf. Children argue over turnip pieces. The bread oven door groans open like a musical crypt. And of course, the rooster continues his career in motivational yelling. You chew slowly. Each sound layers over the next like a woven tapestry of dirt, duty, and barely contained chaos. It's loud, it's alive, it's home. Now for your open academic question. Were medieval mornings peaceful or noisy? Some romanticize rural life as quiet and serene, filled with birdsong and gentle rustling. Others emphasize the reality: clattering pans, human shouting, squealing pigs, and endless banging from tools and livestock. Written records reflect both, depending on whether the source was a sleepy monk or a mother of 6. You're confident it was both. Peace was found in knowing the noise. Each sound meant something. Each voice was a heartbeat. Each clatter was a signal that today was going once again to be a day. You finish your nettle mash. The rooster screams one final flourish. Someone down the lane shouts he's doing it again. You smile. The spoon clinks gently in your bowl. The morning is officially over. Let the real noise begin. 3 crow-worthy breakfast jokes to echo into your day. The rooster, your unpaid, unrequested, and unrelenting life coach. If breakfast had a theme song, it'd be played on clattering pots and passive-aggressive crowing. Medieval snooze button. Good luck outrunning a rooster with a grudge. You bite into the apple and it squelches. Not a good squelch. Not a juicy, crisp orchard moment squelch. A soft, wet, slightly sour squelch. You pull the fruit away and examine it. The top looks perfect, rosy-cheeked, sun-kissed. The bottom collapsed like a medieval bed frame. You sigh and toss it into the bucket-marked pig. Your cousin, who is carefully inspecting her own apple like it might propose marriage, shrugs. "That's number 6, she says. "That's number today," you reply. Welcome to medieval apple season, where nothing is wasted and every bite is a gamble. Here's your historical fact of the day. Apples were everywhere in the medieval world, wild, cultivated, preserved, roasted, fermented, and prayed over. But the apples we imagine today, big, shiny, symmetrical, weren't the norm. Medieval apples were smaller, more sour, and far less predictable. Some were perfect. Some were mealier than a poorly told sermon. And some, well, you're pretty sure they were just round lies pretending to be food. But here's the thing, even the bad ones had a purpose. Your aunt is at the table cutting bruised apples into quarters with practiced speed. One pile is for vinegar, another for baking, a third for cider. The truly rotten ones get scraped into a pot that smells like memories and vinegar's angry cousin. Don't throw any, she warns, not looking up. I wouldn't dream of it, you lie. Here's your quirky detail. Medieval peasants were masters of redemption when it came to fruit. A half-rotten apple could still sweeten a pot of barley porridge. Dried slices were hung by the hearth or tucked into cloth to flavor tea. Even peels were tossed into cauldrons for broth or used in poultices. In Normandy and southern England, apple scraps were often fermented into a kind of rough cider, not pleasant but motivational. One traveler once described it as cheer in a mug with consequences. You sit by the fire peeling apples with a dull knife. The scent is warm and honest, overripe fruit smoke and a bit of damp wool. Your cousin begins frying apple slices with barley flour, egg, and something suspiciously herbal. It's breakfast, she declares. It's revenge, you answer. The pan hisses. The slices curl at the edges. You steal one before it's done and burn your fingers slightly, but it's worth it. Soft on the inside, slightly sour with a caramelized crust that tastes like accidental genius. You close your eyes and chew. This isn't just a snack, this is apple alchemy. Your aunt pulls something from the oven, a flat cake still steaming with chunks of apple and onion studded across the top. You blink. That's bold. She cuts you a piece. You eat it. You blink again. It works. The sweetness of the apple almost forgives the sharpness of the onion. The crust is crisp but forgiving. You chew with respect. Now for your open academic debate. Were apples a staple or a seasonal luxury in the medieval peasant diet? Some records suggest they were everyday fare, eaten raw, stewed, or dried. Others argue apples were more of a bonus, common in some regions, rare in others, and subject to the moods of local trees and weather. Monasteries often had managed orchards, but most peasants relied on wild trees, chance growth, or bartered goods. Your orchard, a tangled mess of sweet hope, squirrel sabotage, and windfall economics. After breakfast, your cousin starts arranging the best apple slices onto a linen square. She'll hang them near the chimney to dry. The worst ones into the pot, they go, skins and all, destined to become some kind of fermented adventure by next week. And the ones in between, well, they go to you. You take a final slice, slightly bruised but still fragrant. You nibble, letting the sweet-sour balance ride the edge of your taste. It's not perfect, it's not even great, but it's real, and sometimes that's exactly enough. 3 slightly overripe jokes to crisp up your day. Medieval apples, the original bite me challenge. If it looks perfect, it's probably for the landlord. Rotten on one side, humble on the other, like most cousins. The bread box creaks like it's ashamed of itself. You open the lid anyway, bracing for disappointment. Inside lies what can only be described as a retired loaf, dry, cracked, possibly sentient, and dusted with something that might be flour or might be time itself. Your cousin peeks over your shoulder. You going to eat that? You nod solemnly. I'm going to transform it. Because this is medieval breakfast and stale bread is not trash, it's potential. Here's your historical fact of the day. In medieval Europe, stale bread wasn't a mistake, it was a strategy. Fresh bread was rare and precious, often reserved for feast days or lords. Most peasant bread was coarse, full of bran, and dried intentionally to last longer. As it hardened, it became more useful for soaking up stew, stuffing into pottage, or grinding into breadcrumbs. And breadcrumbs, they were culinary glue. They thickened broths, patted dumplings, and revived yesterday's everything. You grab the mortar and pestle and begin the work grinding hunks of dry rye and bean loaf into something resembling gravel. Then dust. Then dignity. The sound echoes through the cottage, scrape, pound, crunch, and within minutes the kitchen is filled with breakfast noise and a fine mist of bread powder. Your cousin sneezes dramatically. Bread attack, she says. You pass her the pestle. Here's your quirky tidbit. Breadcrumbs were so common in medieval cooking that some recipes didn't even list them, they were just assumed. A dish that was made thick or bound almost always meant breadcrumbs. In parts of Italy and France, entire sauces were breadcrumb-based, flavored with vinegar, herbs, and garlic. Even meat pies sometimes used soaked crumbs to extend the filling. The medieval motto, if it's dry, add broth. If it's wet, add crumbs. You mix your crumbs with a little warmed milk, leftover egg, chopped leeks, and yesterday's barley scrap. The texture is promising. You form it into small rounds and drop them onto the skillet with a hopeful hiss. They puff slightly. They brown beautifully. They smell like memory and salt. You're not just making breakfast, you're making resourcefulness smell like heaven. As the patties fry, voices begin to drift in from outside. Your neighbors have started their daily gossip circuit, the medieval version of a morning news broadcast, except with fewer facts and more turnip-based drama. She left the pot out all night. Did you see his fence leans worse than my uncle's back? I heard they buy their onions. My bread never cracks like that. You flip a patty. The crunch is deeply satisfying. You offer one to your cousin. She nods, impressed. Then from behind the curtain. So whose crumbs are those? Now for your open academic debate. Were breadcrumbs mostly functional or culinary in medieval kitchens? Some historians view them as practical, a method of reducing waste and stretching limited ingredients. Others argue breadcrumbs added specific texture and flavor, especially in sauces and stuffing. Medieval cookbooks often included instructions for sieving and seasoning crumbs, suggesting a touch of artistry. You believe it was both necessity and intention. Frugality can be delicious if you believe in it hard enough. You finish your last breakfast patty, savoring the crispy edges and warm, savory center. Outside, the gossip has moved to last year's sheep theft and whether someone's chimney smoke smells too fancy. Your cousin wipes the skillet clean with the heel of yesterday's loaf. You nod in approval. That's tomorrow's crumb base. Nothing wasted. Nothing forgotten. Just bread becoming legend, one crunch at a time. 3 slightly crumby jokes to chew on medieval breadcrumbs. Because who needs flavor when you have texture? Yesterday's loaf is today's MVP. In the Middle Ages, carbs didn't go stale, they evolved. You chew slowly, thoughtfully, and very cautiously. Because this morning's salad tastes like regret and weeds. Across the table, your cousin is grinning with far too much satisfaction. It's refreshing, right? She says, nudging her bowl of chopped greens toward you like it's a prize. You nod with the kind of grim courtesy only a medieval peasant could master. Refreshing, in a punishment kind of way. You just bit into a sprig of wild horseradish leaf. It's bitter, spicy, and possibly a legal form of revenge. Here's your historical fact of the day. In medieval Europe, especially among peasants, herbs were medicine, seasoning, and side dish, sometimes all in the same meal. Before salt became affordable and spices were a merchant's dream, flavor came from what grew near your feet. Wild sorrel, mustard leaves, chickweed, nettles, mallow wood. Sorrel cress all picked from fields, paths, and sometimes between fence posts. Some herbs made food taste better. Some just reminded you were alive, especially the bitter ones. Your cousin continues tossing her herb salad with last night's vinegar and a few shreds of onion. You can smell the sharpness from your stool. Did you put wormwood in here, you ask? Just a pinch, she says. You cough. Bold, she beams. Here's your quirky culinary detail. Many medieval herbal breakfasts included intentionally bitter plants, especially in early spring. They were believed to cleanse the body, stimulate appetite, and push out the winter sluggishness. Some households even had a bitterness week where no sweet food was eaten at all, just strong teas, tart pickles, sour bread, and greens that made you pucker like a fish. Some modern scholars believe this practice had real digestive value. Others believe peasants just liked watching each other suffer a little. You crunch on a leaf that tastes like burnt tea and dirt. Your eyes water slightly. You reach for some vinegar-soaked turnip to chase it. Success. You are both punished and nourished. Outside, someone sneezes aggressively. A rooster cackles offended. And inside your stomach, the herbs begin to plot. The bowl of greens is empty now. And your cousin begins heating a pan with leftover broth and diced wild garlic. The scent changes immediately from bitter to bold. You sigh in relief. Garlic at least is your friend. You tear a strip of stale rye bread and dip it into the pan. Savory, salty, not trying to hurt you. Redemption. Now for your open academic debate. Were bitter herbs used out of necessity or belief in their health benefits? Some researchers say medieval people ate what was available, bitter herbs included, because there was nothing else. Others suggest these herbs were revered, even intentionally harvested for specific effects to open the liver, warm the blood, or balance the humors. Herbals from the period list hundreds of plants with detailed instructions. Some sound like recipes, others read more like magical spells. A few do both. You suspect the truth lies in the middle. When food was sparse, meaning became seasoning. As the herb broth simmers, your cousin adds a splash of vinegar, a dried plum, and a scrap of bacon fat. The smell is divine, like a potion meant to charm your taste buds into forgiveness. You dip again. This time it's not bitter, it's brilliant. Even the horseradish makes sense now, buried under layers of intention and fire. You lean back, full and slightly emotionally manipulated. 3 spicy sour jokes to end your herbal ordeal. Medieval herbs, because who needs enemies when your breakfast bites back? Bitterness builds character and possibly clears your sinuses. When life gives you weeds, make soup and pretend it's tradition. The porridge smells like smoke and warm earth. You stir it slowly with a wooden spoon that has by now become more porridge than tree. The mixture bubbles lazily inside a squat clay pot, its sides darkened by 100 breakfasts past. If this pot could talk, it wouldn't whisper, it would mutter, sigh, and remind you that you've burned the bottom. Again. Your cousin leans over your shoulder, sniffs, and says, "At least it's only slightly on fire." You nod proudly. That's flavor. Welcome to clay pot porridge, the medieval equivalent of a hug that judges you. Here's your historical fact of the day. Porridge was the breakfast of the people, thick, flexible, endlessly reheated. And clay pots, they were the crock pots of medieval Europe, placed right in the embers, simmering for hours. Barley, rye, oats, millet, all cooked down with water or thin broth. Some mornings it was barely more than paste. Other days it was spiced with a miracle, maybe a sliver of bacon, a sweet bit of apple, or a pinch of the good salt from the landlord's forgotten barrel. But always it was served in clay, shaped by hand, chipped at the rim and fire-kissed. You scrape the sides of the pot with reverence. The best part is the edge crust, slightly charred, smoky, and firm, like the world's oldest cookie. Your cousin digs in with her own spoon and raises an eyebrow. You remembered the vinegar this time. You do a small bow. I grow wiser with each scalded thumb. Here's your quirky pot detail. Medieval clay pots weren't just cookware, they were kitchen companions. Each pot developed its own seasoning depending on what was cooked inside. Families often had one pot for pottage, one for porridge, and another for do-not-ask experiments. Some pots were passed down through generations, patched with metal staples, wrapped with wire, even sealed with clay from the riverbed. Losing a cooking pot was like losing an elder people mourned, and every pot told stories. usually through soot patterns and small explosions. Your porridge is ready, thick, golden, dotted with fried, leek-dried, sour plum and one rogue lentil you suspect is from last Tuesday. You ladle it into a bowl with a crack down the side and the warmth radiates up into your fingers. You take the first bite, slowly letting the heat fill your mouth. It's soft, smoky, slightly tangy, and somehow deeply familiar even if you've never had this exact version before. That's the magic of porridge. It's always different, it's always home. Someone outside yells that the goats escaped again. No one moves. There's porridge to eat. Now for your open academic debate. Was porridge a culinary blank slate or a cultural signature? Some historians argue porridge was merely utilitarian fuel filler, functional. Others point to regional variations, added herbs, specific grains, and sweeteners as signs of evolving identity. Porridge as regional pride. In northern Italy, porridge became polenta. In Scotland, it was sacred oat ritual. In the Slavic lands, it thickened into kasha lore. In your home, it's both a bowl of everything and nothing, shaped by what's left and lifted by what's shared. You and your cousin finish the pot together, scraping the bottom for every last crusty bit. The pot hisses when water hits its smoke, curling into the air like the end of a lullaby. Outside, the goat bleats in protest as it's retrieved. The rooster sighs dramatically, and inside there's the gentle clink of clay against clay. The pot is empty, the morning is complete. The porridge has always held you together. 3 steamy jokes to stir your soul. Medieval porridge because chewing is optional, but emotional growth is not. The pot's on fire, great, that means it's working. Clay pot's proof that you can survive anything if you're just thick enough. The fire has gone quiet. The goat is asleep. The rooster blessedly has stopped giving his TED talk. You sit by the hearth, knees drawn up under your tunic, and break off a corner of something that technically qualifies as food. A night-crumbled slice of yesterday's oat bread, cold and dry, and somehow exactly what your sleepy mouth needs. Because sometimes the best breakfast comes long after the day is done, when the sky is ink, the candle is low, and the world has decided to hush for a moment. Welcome to Midnight Crumbs and Flickering Wax, the final chapter of the medieval peasant breakfast saga. Here's your historical fact of the day. In medieval homes, midnight snacking wasn't common, but it happened. Especially during winter months when peasants might wake after their first sleep, a natural biphasic sleep cycle to tend fires, check animals, or simply stir in the dark. Some reached for leftover bread. Others sipped thin ale, chewed dried fruit, or even gnawed quietly on bones from supper. There were no chips, no ice cream, no fridge to whisper temptations, just crumbs and wax and silence. You stare at the stub of the candle, its flame bobbing like a sleepy firefly. The wax drips onto the wooden table, pooling beside a dusty onion skin and a button no one remembers losing. You dip the bread into the warm ashes near the hearth. It picks up just enough heat to soften at the edges. You chew slowly. It tastes like toil and forgiveness. Your cousin, half asleep under a ragged quilt, mumbles something about butter ghosts. You nod solemnly. You've seen them too. Here's your quirky candle. Detail candles in peasant homes weren't romantic, they were rare and smoky. Most were made of tallow, the rendered fat of sheep or cattle, and smelled like boiled regret. Beeswax was a luxury reserved for monasteries and lords. Tallow candles smoked, sputtered, and bent like sad torches. But in that low light, every crumb glowed, every bowl looked sacred, and the silence became music. You tear another bite of bread and chase it with a sip of yesterday's vinegar tea, reheated and slightly mysterious. It tastes faintly of time, definitely of clay mug, and strongly of acceptance. This is not a feast. It's not even a proper meal. It's just what's left. And yet it carries a calm the day never could. Now for your open academic debate. Did medieval peasants practice biphasic sleep, and what did they do in between? Some researchers argue that people of the Middle Ages slept in 2 segments. First sleep and second sleep, with a wakeful period in between. During that time, they might pray, think, whisper, snack, or engage in other quiet activities. Others contend this model doesn't apply to all regions or classes, citing differences in labor season and cultural norms. You don't know for sure. But here in this dim corner with crumbs on your fingers and wax on the table, it feels right. It feels ancient. It feels like the night is letting you in on a secret. You finish your last crust. You lick your thumb clean. You snuff the candle with a pinch and the room sighs into darkness. Somewhere in the loft the cat shifts. Somewhere in the garden the wind remembers your name. And somewhere in your belly the quiet bread settles in like a lullaby. 3 crumb-sized jokes to end the night midnight bread. Because sleep is better with just one more bite. Tallow candles lighting your life, fragrancing your nightmares. The first sleep was for work. The second sleep was for dreams, the in-between snacks. So now the story rests. The last crumb has been chewed. The last bowl has cooled. The clay pot sits quietly by the hearth, its soot-stained sides glowing faintly in the low light of memory. You, dear traveler, have walked through the soft, smoky hush of 100 breakfast barley and vinegar apples and nettles, salt and story. You've stirred pots and stirred thoughts. You've tasted bitterness, laughter, and a few too many roasted chestnuts. And now it's time to close your eyes. Let the rooster sleep for once. Let the porridge thicken in your dreams. Let the clay pot hum a lullaby only your bones understand. You don't need candles or crumbs anymore, you just need stillness. Let your breath soften like barley soaking in warm water. Let your mind steep in quiet the way herbs steeped in morning broth. Let the world outside blur into parchment and old wood and the soft tap of spoon against bowl. No need to carry anything with you, not the goat's grudge, not the bread's crust, not even the cousin's bad jokes. Leave it all by the fire. And know this, even the simplest breakfast has a legacy. Even the humblest crumbs can tell a story. Even you right here, right now, are part of that gentle ancient ritual. So rest, let the clay pots cool. Let the candle melt, let morning wait. That's the story for tonight. May your dreams be filled with wonder and peace.